Yo, what's going on, guys? Mike from Mike Talk Sports. In honor of Kevin Lee rejoining the UFC, I thought I could talk about Kevin Lee for a little bit, talk about his strengths and weaknesses going forward in the UFC, and give you guys two potential opponents I think not only would be really fun matchups, but would make sense matchmaking-wise. So Kevin Lee just announced he's going to be back in the UFC. He did not specify whether he's going to be returning at 155 or 170. So for these two opponents that I'm going to list at the end of the video, one of them he could face at either 155 or 170. The other one would strictly be at 170. So Kevin Lee's last three fights, a decision win against Diego Sanchez in Eagle FC. Not really too sure how that win would get him back into the UFC. After losing his last two before that, a decision loss against Daniel Rodriguez and a submission loss against Charles Oliveira. Now, those two losses aged pretty well. Charles Oliveira obviously went on to be the lightweight champion of the world and had a pretty dominant run on top, a really fun champion. So again, that aged well. And Daniel Rodriguez, he just got a win versus Li Jingliang, and he's a ranked welterweight. So not the worst two losses to have on your record in the world. Again, he's only 30 years old, so I think he still might have some potential going forward. I think Kevin Lee realistically went into the UFC and said, look guys, look Dana White, look Hunter Campbell, I wasn't in the best mental state my last three fights in the UFC, which is why I kind of had that losing skid. My priorities and training were kind of all over the place. If you guys give me one more chance, I'm going to prove to you guys why I belong in the UFC. And the UFC complied partly because I think Kevin Lee was pretty good promotionally wise back when he was making that run, back when he fought Tony Ferguson for the interim belt. Not only that, but he would take some fights on short notice, and he would take some fights where his opponent dropped out last minute, and he'd still fight to save the card. So Kevin Lee has done some favors for the UFC. I think this is the UFC kind of patting his back and giving him one more chance. So getting into some of Kevin Lee's strengths, and there are a lot. He's kind of a what-if story and a lost potential story to a lot of UFC and MMA fans. His offensive wrestling and grappling is obviously the first thing you're going to talk about. He's really good at chaining together positions on grappling exchanges on the feet. He's good at kind of chaining a single leg into a body clinch, into a takedown. His blast double leg is really good. It's probably his best takedown. And then he's kind of like Aljamain Sterling in the sense of when he takes you down, his main goal is to take your back. He's a backpack in that way. He has that 77-inch reach, which people kind of say that reach isn't great for grappling. Sometimes it's not good, and sometimes it's kind of good to have a smaller reach for grappling, but in the case of trying to get someone's back and attack that rear naked choke, that longer reach can be beneficial. So that's something that Kevin Lee does have to his advantage. And then when you look at his offensive jiu-jitsu, it's pretty solid. So on the feet, Kevin Lee is surprisingly good on the feet. So again, like I just said, he has a 77-inch reach, and he really is a lanky fighter on the feet. He loves using that jab and jab straight combination, really active striker, which leads to some of his weaknesses in terms of his cardio and striking defense, which we'll get into in a second. But again, he's a very pressure-based fighter. He's always on his front foot. Something else he's very good at in terms of on the feet is he's very good at feinting level changes. So he'll kind of feint a takedown into a knee. He'll feint a takedown into a jab straight. He's good at those level changes and threatening the grappling. Something he's also good at is reading feints and timing them with head kicks. So you see against his matchup against Tony Ferguson, for example, I know he lost that fight, but he was good at reading Tony Ferguson's movement. So let's say if Tony Ferguson feinted very hard to the right, he usually timed him with a head kick that would land on the right side of Tony Ferguson. So Kevin Lee has really proven to have somewhat of a high IQ when fighting, but getting into some of his weaknesses, his cardio has always been an issue. It seems as though Kevin Lee comes out in the first round, does really good with his offensive grappling, looks good on the feet, And then come round 2, come round 3, he just loses it or gets stopped because his cardio is bad. It seems as though he has an adrenaline dump after the first round. That's something he really has to fix in terms of his preparation and just preparation in terms of going into the fight. Sometimes you can prepare and have your cardio be 5-round cardio. You go into a 3-round fight and you gas right away because you just dump your adrenaline. You go for the finish and you go for these striking techniques that are not indicative of having a long-lasting fight in terms of his cardio. His head movement's never been great. His defensive stand-up, again, he's really good at using that lead check hook when he's kind of countering in the pocket. He does like countering in the pocket, even though he's a lanky fighter on the feet. So his stand-up in terms of defense, he really relies on those check hook counters. He's not that good of backing away in spaces. Again, his offense is kind of his defense in a sense, which has been the downfall of Kevin Lee at times on the feet. His takedown defense is okay. It's not the greatest. We've seen him get taken down sometimes in the past. And again, that's more cardio-based. I feel as though in the first or second round, early second round, he's not really going to get taken down. And then late second round, mid-second round, third round, he's going to get taken down because of that explosive athleticism is lost due to that cardio dump. And again, his defensive jiu-jitsu is solid. It's nothing to write home about. He can get caught in a submission and lose in that way, and he can get out of some submissions unless he's facing a guy like Charles do Bronx Oliveira. So getting into 2 potential fights that I would love to see from Kevin Lee. One is Michael Johnson. So Michael Johnson is obviously a pretty big name still in the lightweight division. I didn't want to give Kevin Lee any ranked opponents right away, but I wanted to give him 2 fun veteran names that he can really sell the fight with. And at the same time, he has a solid chance of winning because at the end of the day, I'd rather not throw Kevin Lee to some young guy that's just going to beat him up because he's still 30 years old and I still think he has potential in the UFC. So Michael Johnson's a guy, 2-1 in his last 3. He has very good boxing, as we all know. And you know what? He's a good counter wrestler. So I think if Michael Johnson could stuff some takedowns early on in this fight, which I would expect him to do, I think he could piece up Kevin Lee on the feet. And I think this would be a really good, fun fight on the feet. Again, really good counter wrestling. Not too kick heavy, so I don't know if Kevin Lee could catch one of Michael Johnson's kicks, dump him to the ground, and find a submission in that way. I think he would need to grapple in a more traditional sense, double leg takedowns, training the single leg, getting to the clinch, getting a body lock, getting some Greco-Roman trips from the clinch. So again, in that matchup, I would probably favor Michael Johnson, to be honest. I think his striking is just too intelligent for Kevin Lee, and I think he would be able to survive in the grappling realm. A second fight I would love to see from Kevin Lee is Robbie Lawler. So Robbie Lawler is 1-3 in his last 3 fights. He suffered that knockout loss, trading in the pocket. Man, Robbie Lawler looked good in that fight, but he just got caught hard with that knockout. Again, he's a solid inside boxer, kind of some similar strengths and weaknesses as Michael Johnson as well, just at 170. Solid inside boxer. He still has some solid power to him. He's really good in the scrambles, and he has solid takedown defense. So, again, he's a good counter wrestler. I don't think he's a guy who would be absolutely controlled and just submitted right away against Kevin Lee. But Robbie Lawler's a guy who I would expect Kevin Lee to honestly beat. I think Kevin Lee would have not really a strength advantage because Robbie Lawler's a bigger guy. I think he'd probably step into the octagon weighing a little bit more than Kevin Lee, but Kevin Lee is much more explosive than Robbie Lawler at this point. I think after 2 or 3 takedown attempts, Kevin Lee would be able to get a takedown, get to dominant position, ground and pound Robbie Lawler. I could see a second or third round stoppage via ground strikes from Kevin Lee. On the feet, I could see Robbie Lawler catching himself into a head kick from Kevin Lee. Again, I think this would be a really fun fight. We can see one last war from Robbie Lawler if his counter wrestling is good enough in this fight. He could stuff some takedowns right away and have Kevin Lee kind of at bay at his range and try to get into range, dip in with some body hooks, dip in with some hooks to the head, and just find his range. So I think Robbie Lawler would be a really fun fight with Kevin Lee. Again, I'd probably pick Kevin Lee by a second or third round submission or a second or third round knockout via ground and pound. Fun thing about both of these fights is that I doubt either one goes to a decision. So welcome back to the UFC, Kevin Lee.